I'm delighted to welcome Rehab Nazzal, who joins us today from Bethlehem. It wasn't easy to get here, so we're especially excited and delighted that she was able to join us this weekend. Thank you so much for making the difficult trip from Bethlehem. Rehab is a multidisciplinary artist. Her work encompasses photography, video, installation, and sound art as well, some of which she'll be sharing with us this afternoon. Rehab is also a PhD student in visual art at Western University in London, Ontario. She's normally based in Toronto, and right now she's teaching at Dar el Kalima University of Arts and Culture in Bethlehem. And again, I'm really excited to hear you speak this afternoon.
I want to thank you so much, John and Claudette, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be among this group of thinkers. And oh, you're not hearing? Okay. I said it's my pleasure to be among this group of scholars and artists and students. It has been great since the beginning, actually, as Ellen mentioned. I haven't felt bored for a minute even. And the topics that have been discussed are connected, definitely. And that's maybe what makes it interesting. As it was said, I am in Palestine now. I left Palestine when I was a teenager, and I returned this summer. I returned to work there, and to this minute, I am still in a state of shock of what I'm seeing. Palestine that I know that I left 30 years ago, it's not there. The landscape is destroyed. The country is divided. I'm talking about the West Bank. The West Bank is divided into small cantons, and further research would reveal that Gaza actually was a model first to be practiced and realized in the West Bank, creating closed cantons. The first month I arrived, the Israeli forces were confiscating 600 dunams of Bethlehem's land. That leaves Bethlehem basically with the suburb with no land at all. So it becomes a prison surrounded either by settlements or by the concrete wall. So back to my study and my practice. During the past 2 years, I've been researching drone warfare. And all the time, I was focusing or trying to get to the ground instead of studying or researching the drone warfare from the sky in an abstract way, trying to get to the ground, to the victims. But I am far from the victims. I tried to get a permit to get to Gaza, which is part of the occupied Palestinian land in 1967. I tried, but I couldn't. I wired a permit from the Israeli authority through an Israeli lawyer who interrogated me since I was born to this second. It's crazy, and no permit. So in the West Bank, the drones themselves are not present. Not present because the colonies in the West Bank, side by side with the Palestinian community, the Palestinian cities and villages, even the sound, the drones are so high that are not visible. And if they have any function, it's surveillance. They're used for surveillance. I met with some farmers from the north of West Bank. They actually monitor the Palestinian use of water. If someone tried to dig a well or something in the north, the next day the Israeli army would come. So people are aware that there is always drone above them, but it doesn't have that sound that we see in Gaza. In Gaza, That's one of the work I created last year. Created, the term is wrong. I recorded. It's a work about the sound of drones in Gaza. During the 50 Days War, I was connected with activists and journalists from Gaza and managed to record the sound that the Gazans are hearing 24 hours. During my visit this time, I met with an artist who came from Gaza and asked if they still hear the noise of the drones, and she said yes, and she talked about what exactly is being described in the research that Dr. Atif Abu Sitta from Gaza described, which is titled Sleepless in Gaza. He described the effect on the children and their education and their well-being in their social life. So it's a torture, the noise itself. And the noise, I'll let you hear the noise actually, or a bit of it. I think that's enough about the sound. Susan Shubli wrote a wonderful essay about the sound, the noise of drones in southeast Pakistan, was it? And how for 11 years the people there have been experiencing this noise. So the noise by itself, if you hear it now, the effect of it on you, it's not as it is on those who are under the fire of drone, because it is connected to actually to death. A sound, a noise of a drone means that there might be a strike any minute. And that's why it's only a propeller, as Susan said, that's only the sound. And there is now an intention actually to reduce the sound, but if you ask the people, they want the sound so they can identify it, there is a strike coming. So, Palestine. These are the issues that I deal with. Okay, this is the situation that I deal with myself as a Palestinian artist, Palestinian woman who grew up in a family. My parents were fighting the British colonialism, then we moved into the Israeli colonialism. My father died without being free one day in his life. I am continuing, my children, the entire Palestinian population living these conditions. It is a war. It's not only with the Zionist movement. It is with the Western world. And that has been clear for every Palestinian. When Britain was the world power, we were fighting world power as Britain. That created the state of Israel, that hand in hand worked with the Zionist movement in expelling 800,000 Palestinians from their land and becoming now refugees, about 7 million everywhere, including part of them who for the second or the third time are expelled from Libya and Iraq and Syria. Those same refugees, they were expelled where the state of Israel was established with the support, the sponsorship, the help of Britain. And after the shift of world power to United States, now United States is the sponsor of Israel. So the issue of muteness toward Israel's nuclear weapon program. No one mentioned it, by the way. I tried to listen if any of the presenters mentioned Israel's weapon program. because at least in February 2015, the Pentagon released a report the first time admitting that, yes, Israel has a weapon program, but was not discussed. The UN never brought it up. So this status of the State of Israel above international law, this immunity that Israel enjoys, this silence from the world, this muteness, is leading the Palestinian people alone to resist, one time after the other. And now there is a third intifada in the making. These are the conditions I left the country in. I left the country where there is a prime minister of the occupation state who instructed the soldiers, the occupation forces, to shoot kids who throw stones, or capture them and sentence them 10 to 20 years. This is what we're dealing with. In fact, a few days ago, he blamed us for the Holocaust. Mr. Netanyahu excused Hitler. Okay, so emotional. I would really share with you some of the Israeli officials, generals, thinkers of what they think of where we're heading, and Israel's contribution to many things. One of it, targeted assassination, is a thesis, according to one Israeli colonial. It's a thesis, the invention of the State of Israel, and it's now expanding. So here, about Gaza. Our vision of air control zeroes in on the notion of control. We're looking at how you control a city or a territory from the air when it's no longer legitimate to hold or occupy that territory on the ground. And that's exactly what happened in Gaza. In Gaza, the forces withdrew from within Gaza to the borders, and they occupied the air and held the entire Gaza Strip, 1.8 Palestinians on a piece of land, 365 square kilometers only. By withdrawing their forces, the Israelis thought they're not accountable to international law any longer, that they are not an occupying power. And this is dangerous if it's replicated by other countries that would use this colonial power by having no responsibility toward the people they occupied or colonized or tortured. And of course, the accountability to international law. If you're not an occupying power on the ground and only from the air, there is no regulation in the United Nations, there is no regulation in the law. Like, for example, Fourth Geneva Convention, it regulates the relationship between the occupied people and the occupying power. But when there are no forces on the ground and just from the air, so here the issue, there is no law, or they escape the law because they are in fact occupying. Colonel Daniel Riznar explaining here what we're seeing, quote, now is a revision of international law. If you do something for long enough, the world will accept it. The whole of international law is now based on the notion that an act that is forbidden today becomes permissible if executed by enough countries. International law progresses through violations. We invented the targeted assassination thesis, and we had to push it. And here, my interest in the drone warfare and its link to targeted assassination, because the State of Israel, since its establishment, has been practicing targeted assassination against the Palestinians. It's well known, started in 1972, the first assassinated that is known, he's an artist, Akram Zaatri, in Rome. Then it spread, the assassination, throughout Europe. I made a work about this, still researching, still collecting information, because if there is anything about our struggle, Israel doesn't allow us to grieve, have time to grieve, have time to cope. It's like one after another, these campaigns, these wars. So I'm collecting information, and it's not easy at all, about those who were assassinated inside Palestine and across the world. I made a 4-minute video which was attacked by the representative of the State of Israel here. Before I move to the work, I'd like just this quote of Deleuze, and it's from 1970s, actually. He stated this, was published in Le Monde Diplomatique, but republished in 1998. And I think, and I believe that is true, Israel is establishing a model of repression. When violating the law once, twice, and 100 times, and there is silence, other countries will start replicating this. When there is no accountability to international law, when you assassinate, and you have the right anywhere to assassinate leaders, artists, thinkers, professors, no accountability, then other countries will follow the lead. So yes, this is, I see it true. Here among the themes I work with: working under occupation, loss and commemoration, confinement and torture, state control of images, targeting senses. And this relates to the sound and the drone that I am working on. Distant noise, drones noise. Stones and drones. I spoke with someone about this ironic comparison. Now, during the daily clashes in Palestine with the Israeli forces, just watching them closely, they are trained on a high-tech weapon use. So when they're facing kids with stones, it's just hilarious, really, to watch it. So you have the Israeli government claiming they're defending themselves. So with drones and all these military equipments, they're facing the children with stones. That's a self-defense. This a photographic project about Palestinian women prisoners. This woman refused to be photographed. She spent 10 years, and she's still being targeted, but she has a whole full room full with solidarity messages she received from around the world while she's in prison. And she managed, when she was released, to get them to her place. It was an amazing moment I spent with her, seeing this solidarity, and that is actually what is going to help the Palestinian people and the Israeli people as well, to get us to coexist peacefully, to stand in the face of this network of aggression of Zionism, and it spread from Canada to US to Europe, everywhere. It's the solidarity across the world. Yeah, this is one. The assassination, this is from my town, one of the earliest photographs, how the Arabized, it's called Arabized units. It has been used 3 weeks ago. These are special Israeli units who are trained to dress like Palestinians and infiltrate among Palestinians and shoot and kill. So those in Birzeit University. 3 of them, just 3 weeks ago, they infiltrated and shot Palestinians. One of them paralyzed half his leg. This is from my town in 2006, Arabized unit shot the person in his seat in the car with a missile, or I don't know what is this. Okay, I know I don't have time, so I'm gonna start skipping. This project, Invisible, it consists of few videos and 2,000 photographs. The same topics I talked about, which is targeting senses, the tear gas effect, there is a video about it, mourning, and this is one protest. Well, this is my brother's funeral, who was assassinated in Europe by the Israeli Mossad. So I made a silent video about his funeral. And another video about the abuse of the Palestinian political prisoners. So in 2007, Israel conducted, one of the Israeli units conducted a military exercise in one of the prisons. After midnight, for no reason whatsoever other than just exercising, practicing, testing methods of control, method of torture. And one of the prisoners was killed and 200 were injured. The family of the one who was injured, they filed a case against the army and requested the release of a video that a soldier or soldiers were recording. After 4 years, a highly censored footage was released, the first time ever, by the Israeli High Court. I took that footage and separated the sound from the image. The image, I took it, the frames, grabbed the frames and made them as squares and created another 1,000 black squares and just installed them on a wall straight. With the sound itself was in an enclosed dark space with, of course, translation of the content. So these are a closer look into these frames from the footage. Just a few, how much I have to? Okay. Ah.
اسمعوا يا شباب، ولا واحد بيزيح بنتخوا غير.
It's 6.5 minutes. It just horrific. I mean, if it reminded me of anything when I first listened to it, of Abu Ghraib. Exactly. With the difference of the type of torture, but it's the same violations of their rights. This video, I'll show a few seconds of it. This is the one I've been working about, those assassinated, and that's what outraged the Israeli ambassador in Ottawa last year when it was exhibited, accusing me and accusing the work of glorifying terrorism. And of course, without going into detail, the artist and the activist community in Canada stood by my right of expression. And all the attempts by the Israeli embassy, the ambassador, the conservative MPs and Senate, the pressure on the mayor to shut down the exhibition failed. And this was another example for me. I mean, if it happens with me and if they succeeded, they will succeed with someone else, etc. So it was defending our rights as a community of self-expression, regardless who we are criticizing. They were invited, and I always experience problems when I exhibit my work, but I'm open to dialogue always as well. So this is very symbolic, really. It doesn't have much context, I would say. Yeah, am I? Okay, I'll take a little bit. The sound bomb. This is from the current.
We had a peaceful demonstration here. Why did you let him arrest him? What did he do? What did he do? Why did you let him arrest him? Release him now. Release him now. الحق الحقيقي للاحتلال وبالتالي نحن صامدون لن يرهبنا لا هذه الأسلحة ولا هذا.
I'll just show you quickly a few photographs from the clashes before I conclude. Yeah, exactly. So these are images from Bethlehem. This is the wall. This is where the clashes actually take place beside one of these towers. This is Beit Jala, where the land to the left all now is a subject of confiscation. You see the tower in the top that is exactly above the suburb of Beit Jala. And beside it, to the left on the top of the mountain, there is a colony. So in order to confiscate the land and build the wall, they need to mark and stamp the trees, marking with a ribbon, either red or pink, the olive trees, and numbering them with red. And then I would call it the massacre began. The massacre to the olive trees, some of them 1,000 years old. And we're standing there, the owners of the land standing there helpless. They can do nothing. Here they are, I mean, facing these, nothing. Even religious figures praying, trying to convince the soldiers to stop, because for a Palestinian, uprooting an olive tree is like killing a child. They tend Palestinians, the trees, like they take care of their children. And I know this because my father do this. There we are. Okay. I think, okay, before I conclude, I would like to invite all of you to join the BDS movement. If you haven't done so yet. Boycott, divestment, and sanction of Israel. This is a non-violent way of supporting the Palestinians, forcing Israel to abide by international law, to withdraw from the occupied Palestinian territories, and the refugees' right to return be addressed. It is important, it's significant, it worked in South Africa, and it would work with us. Thank you.
Thanks to all of you. It was very thought-provoking. My question is for James, maybe to address Anonymous. Like when you talked about all of this data that's available to us and the way in which it can get leaked, you know, as someone who's an activist, often the people who claim the term anonymous do things that seem very inspiring, revealing the police officer who shot somebody recently in Montreal, revealing the addresses and names of police officers. So there's this subversive quality to it all. And of course, we look at Chelsea Manning and Snowden as heroes. So you seem to be problematizing that a bit. And I'm wondering if you could address that specifically in terms of that kind of left-wing or perceived as left-wing subversion by people like Anonymous or other whistleblowers or leakers.
I wouldn't say much to that, except to say that I don't want to completely invalidate the entire history of the power of surveillance and the power of turning this image making back onto the image makers and all of those interactions that are kind of possible within that. But for myself, I think we have also become stuck in a loop between those things that doesn't sufficiently account for power within those relationships. That leaves us vulnerable constantly to kind of strike and counter-strike and an arms race, which is a big part of all these kind of discussions we've had today. Those practices will continue to have huge amounts of power, and whistleblowing remains incredibly important, and so does photography in the context of writing human rights abuses and all those kind of different ways in which it can work. But it's also not enough. It's no longer enough because it's in part because it's a focus on. For me, it narrows the field of view increasingly. I think I'd really like to hear your position on this, in terms of what you're saying about not making single photos anymore, or not, to talk about this kind of not focusing on the single image or the single revelation anymore is also a recognition that they exist within, I'm just rambling now. I don't want to invalidate those practices. I think we're starting to see that they are insufficient in the long run. And by the long run, I do mean species length time. So it's not like time we should dump them right now. But I think there needs to be a wide discussion about what follows those practices.
I have a question. I've been thinking about something listening to all three of you, in terms of something Joe said in his talk that I can't get out of my head, which is that nuclear testing has turned into actual warfare, and that there's a kind of collapsing between the test, the preparation, and the act itself. And I guess when I think of drone wedding, I see a kind of, I'm wondering if you're advocating a kind of collapsing of the event and the representation of the event. And then I see in James, your piece, in your talk, and I don't know yet how I feel about this, but it seems to me, correct me if I'm wrong, that you're saying it's not just an analogy. Big data and radiation and toxicity. That you want to somehow expand the category, or at least produce it as a generative category that might repoliticize us. And then it leads me to to Palestine, and I'm wondering what that kind of move might mean for you on the ground. If it's something that could be if that's something you might want to reject because the struggle that you have right there doesn't allow, wants to hold these categories separate. The category being there and the representations of it, or if it's something that maybe also might be mobilized in your own work.
I'll take the middle part in relation to drone wedding, and I think very much that was part of the strategy, which is also why we decided to stage wedding, and that for a while it was hard for us to sort of almost separate the actual outcome of the piece and the actual performance of it as well, because the performance was as much the piece as what ended up being the 8-channel work. And just sort of being in that space and having this wedding, having this drone, having people interact with it, was in a way trying to understand it, not so much deconstruct the power of that drone, but to at least sort of crack that open a little bit to understand it. And certainly, I think there was, we weren't thinking about it in terms of bringing the war home, but we were trying to collapse some of those very broad distinctions made between over there and over here, in the sense of talking about how this is pervasive, that it has completely different implications for us, but that it is part of a larger network and a larger mechanism. So.
It's very complicated in Palestine, dealing with image. And through my work, I've been experimenting with moving image without sound, muting the sound fully, or removing the image and keeping the sound. And this has to do with the Western culture, how it's really based on vision and denying the other senses, if I'm understanding your question. But it's complicated, and we have to look at the conditions in Palestine in a different way, because you have a colonial regime that practices oppression on a daily basis, and it fights the image. It's covert operations, what they do, like just drawing a line in any piece of land within colonized West Bank would mean it's a military zone, and military zone, no photographing allowed, for example. So for me, and I'll speak straight, photographing there, taking images, it's like having an evidence of something that took place. That's how significant. On the other hand, conceptually, I am very much interested in the effect of sound, because it ties us together as human beings everywhere, anywhere. The sound itself, without the image, it removes all biases, all stereotypes, and it just connects us to the feeling, the feeling of fear, the feeling of excitement, any form of feeling. I went further than that. Thanks. I don't know if I answered.
Thank you for actually probably expressing that rather more elegantly what I was trying to say in mind. I think that I'm going to, could you write that down? But I would just to say about that collapse is important to what I'm thinking about, and it comes from two explicit or more things in my work. The first one of which is working with drones and looking at the history of what a lot of us have been talking about in terms of that, and watching specifically the kind of what's been called the Palestinianization of the whole world, which is not, I hope, to downgrade the Palestinian experience as part of it, but the way in which technologies developed in that crucible have been spread out across the whole world in many ways, and the fact that technology is an encoded politics that can then be redeployed on multiple different sites to kind of carry so many of those different actions and ways of seeing with it as it goes. And the second part of that is I did a project last year where I flew a massive military surveillance balloon over South London, and I put a camera on it because aerial photos are cool. and because I wanted to interrogate the notion of the view from the air and the sky. And then I had to take that camera off it because I was doing more surveillance. And I got to a point with that project that I felt I could not make any more images at all, because every image that I was making in the course of that project was a surveillance image. And it led me to this kind of block in the work where it's like, how do you make work about surveillance that doesn't do more surveillance? How do you make work about vision systems that doesn't perpetuate the mechanics and the politics of those vision systems? And this is a project I think many people have run up to in various ways. But exactly that for me, that so many of these practices, including the very base kind of visible, invisible, visible type trajectory, felt complicit with those kind of structures. As we heard in the talk earlier of how much of our vision systems are the products of nuclear explosions. That multiplied 1,000 times over.
I'd like to invoke my privilege here by asking a question to James, which is how then do you make art after reaching the conclusion you reached in this paper? Is it over?
No, obviously not. That's what we're all here to figure out, but I'm not going to pretend I have a direct answer to that question.
Yeah, I mean, similarly, I think we all have hit walls for sure. And I think that, you know, it was so striking, I think, in Rehab's work specifically, when you just don't see the image. And I've always remembered that piece, and it's such a powerful piece, because once you remove that image, you know, you start to put your other faculties into it, and you work much harder. But we are so overwhelmed and bombarded, and which is why I was saying in my talk as well, it's like, where is that space for us now? And I think that that's something that we face pretty regularly now as artists. I don't think you stop, you just sort of keep trying to dodge left and right.
Well, actually, I thought of a filmmaker, I think it's Chris Marker, and I think his last film, Crossover in Dubai, and it's not well known. Crossover in Dubai, and it's about the assassination of a Palestinian leader in Dubai that was captured by CCTV, the state surveillance, the entire process. So he just took the footage and changed the sound, inserted a well-known piece of music, and made it his work. But it's loaded with meanings and thoughts about how surveillance, like while you're recording, your surveillance, the surveilled, etc. It's a cycle. Yeah.
I mean, sorry, go ahead. I was just going to say, I don't think you jettison your practice. I think that you find other ways and other means, but I think it also goes to the very heart of what your practice is. So I don't know if that makes sense, but let's try that.
Hi, thank you. I want to take your point, because I agree that the transparency is still very blurred and it's non-existent, but it's also because it's so frightening. There's a website called mindjustice.org, which has documented the use of electromagnetic radiation on the human brain during the Cold War by all the superpowers. It's connected to, I believe, the University of California, and a lot of the reports have been presented to the United Nations, which is chiefly ignored as much as Israel having a nuclear weapons program. It's also very much connected to what's happening in neurology and the law and neuroscience, particularly in the United States and other prison systems, for example, where they would use different psychobabble to construct criminal behavior rather than take issue with white on crime in our banking systems, etc. So I just wanted to articulate that because I think it's important. I also just think it's important that mindjustice.org be used as a cross-reference for academics and artists. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Ian Bowl here. Thanks all three of you. Very, very rich session. I just wanted to pick up on the puzzle that we're left with here. And it seemed to me to connect to something that I was grappling with at the end there this morning, namely perhaps the end of the Enlightenment project. I mean, Chomsky is a classic of someone, I think, who still believe that you can tear the mask off power and then, you know, things will crumble. It's just, it isn't happening. I mean, maybe you can surprise the ruling class once a generation. Nick Walter and the others who went into RSG 6, that did make a difference, a big difference politically. But we're no longer in that situation. So I just want to share this important question, and it's the question we finished Afflicted Powers with, what would image making against spectacle look like? And I think, we're honestly up against it here. And we've landed on the right question. And these are certainly all very powerful interventions, but making the linkages between the wafer makers and the drones is useful and important, but where then? So really, I'm not getting any further. I'm just reiterating that it's a damn good question.
I think partially, though, Ian, it's also the question is not so much what would it look like, but I think it's how do we employ? And I think we've been trying that. How do we employ images? How do we use them? So I think it's, I think we've used many strategies over the years to try and unspectacularize the image. And I think that, like various actions, things have worked over time in certain times. I think we have come to the end of it to some degree. But I think now the question is different. The question is, how do those images, how do they get deployed? And I think that was partially at least one of the strategies we were trying with the randomization, just to sort of stop thinking about the image as if this image is important. But rather it's the network of images and the collective story that the images are creating through some kind of randomized, without selection at that point, without the edit. Perhaps a feeble attempt, but an attempt nonetheless to bring that issue to the fore.
To go slightly back well, not to go back what I said, but to give a couple of examples. The image practices that do, I think, really interest me are the ones where that evidentiary quality or activated quality is actually way above the point of the image. And so, for example, I would take the forensic architecture's work as a place within that considers the legal ground and those like really where it's going. That actually treats the image as a program that learns from what I would call the network computers, my obsession with technology, and sees in that a model for how this stuff should go forward. An example of even just a few images is Trevor Paglen's project of photographing the NSA and NRO and these Washington buildings. But the work in that work is not the images. The work in those work is the licensing of those images, in which they're released into the public domain to supplant images that were provided in other ways. It still falls foul of some of my rules, but I think there's something in those kind of image practices that are treating the image as I don't know, as merely a way into other structures. And that's not right. Something along those lines, anyway.